Dorwinion are another one of those factions within the game where there isn't a huge amount of official lore to go off of. Indeed, the only thing that is really roundly known about them is the fact that they produce an awful lot of wine, which of course doesn't really have too much to do with what we're interested in from a total war perspective, but they must have a military of sorts because they are the furthest east good aligned faction, or at least completely good aligned faction that the game has to offer. And in that respect as well, they have a little bit in common with one of their nearby neighbours in the Rovanion, in that they are one of the hybrid factions in the game, and perhaps from a little bit more of a interesting angle as well, because they have a human and an elven component to their roster as well, which is another one of those reasons why it's a little bit of a shame why there's so little to go off of when it comes to Dorwinion, and this is largely the case when it comes to a lot of Tolkien's work. The further east that you go, things get a little bit more mysterious, and it kind of starts really from Dorwinion and then it continues from there. A little bit more perhaps is known about their most nearest enemies in the shape of the Easterlings of Rune, but especially from their elven perspective, I mean, the fact that there are humans settling in this region and the fact that they are not necessarily evil aligned is maybe not the most surprising thing, but the fact that they have that Morroquendi component to them is a rather strange curiosity, considering the fact that most other factions in the game have a very fixed focus to what their units have in reserve. But let's talk a little bit now about what Dorwinion actually have to offer in these respects, and for the most part what I've already mentioned with regards to a little bit of what Dorwinion actually are, a lot of that is actually bound up in what their strengths are as well, and we'll start off with the fact that they have a dependable human unit core that they can rely upon to be their front line. Now, this is in a number of ways. The most obvious way is the infantry, the fact that many a human faction that as you go further west are going to have a combination of a sword and shield infantry unit and a spear and shield infantry unit that they can use as an effective front line, reasonably cost effective, reasonably decent in terms of their melee stats, not too expensive for what they offer, and also quite resilient as well in terms of the armour. And all of those things are true for Dorwinion as well, albeit with some slight tweaks to what they are focused on. They're not quite as numerous as some of the human kingdoms from further westward, but that certainly makes sense considering the fact that Dorwinion is not the largest kingdom and region that Middle-earth has to offer, but also the fact that they have access to their elven allies and the training that elves go through. A little bit of that has filtered down into their human units as well, so they've got a little bit of extra stamina going for them, in addition to the typical armour and shield focus that a lot of these regular human units from other human kingdoms tend to traffic in. But also this extends to their archers, and they also have bodyguard tier units in this respect as well. And it just gives you that solid base that you can build on, which many other completely elven factions cannot rely upon. They are going to have to completely depend upon their elven units to be able to sort of weather a storm, which in terms of a numbers perspective they may not be able to do. But the fact that Dorwinion can dip into this way of thinking does give them that little bit of flexibility when it comes to deploying another one of their strengths, which is damaging elven units. Now, the vast majority of the damage that Dorwinion are going to be doing is going to come from their elven units. The human units outside of the bodyguard tier ones are much more functional in nature, whereas the elven ones are going to be able to dish out an awful lot more punishment. There's a little bit more of a wide variety of elven units as well, because all of the Dorwinion cavalry units that you have access to are going to be elven riders. Also stuff like shock infantry, elven archers as well. All of this sort of thing is going to be, fully Morroquendi class units. Interestingly enough, not all of their units are completely damage focused. The pole arms that Dorwinion have access to are an elf pole arm, but this also means that they're going to be slightly more damaging than your equivalent pikes from other factions. But again, they do have some certain downsides in other areas, which we'll get onto a little bit later. But if you're going to be successful as Dorwinion, the elves are probably the where you're going to be winning battles. The human units are going to be the ones which keep you competitive and prevent you from losing battles quite so easily, but the elven units, because of how much damage that they can dish out across their various types and classes, this is how you're going to be winning most of your battles as a general rule. And obviously it goes without saying as well that elves, they are fairly pricey, maybe not quite as pricey as some of the higher tier elves from other factions as a general rule, the Morroquendi, but you're going to be able to get an awful lot of quality out of these units as well. And that brings us on to the final point that I would make here about Dorwinion strengths, and that is unit synergy. The interplay between these human and elven units is key, and understanding it and really utilising it to its fullest effect is very, very important as Dorwinion. And it's going to be how you, again, win your battles overall. Those human units as the base, those elven units as the damage, and how they work together is important. And, there are certain, the compositions that Dorwinion can put down, as we'll talk about as we go into the units on the open field a little bit later on, are maybe a little bit more limiting, but how you fit them together and what you choose to prioritise in terms of your damage dealers, in terms of your front line, some of your cheaper units perhaps blended in with some of the more expensive units, which Dorwinion do have their fair share of, is going to be key, because your opponent is largely going to know what's coming when you're playing as Dorwinion in broad strokes, but the finer details and how you fit these units together and how they fight together on the open field in close proximity to one another is going to be an important aspect of what they do. And that is of course true of any army, but Dorwinion tends to depend upon it, but it's also a little bit easier to enact with them because of the varied strengths that these two types of units do offer you. But directly linked to that, I would suggest, is their main weakness as well, which is the fact they have a relatively small roster. And this was true of Dorwinion even before some of the rosters within the latest version of the game got reduced a little bit, so that the unit bloat didn't really, become too prolific throughout the game as a whole. But the small roster has always been one of Dorwinion's main downsides, you would say. And like I just said, it's kind of obvious what kind of threats you're going to be facing as Dorwinion. And, it's easier to prepare for something when you kind of have an idea about what's going to be coming your way. You know that there's going to be a certain number of the human units. You know that there's going to be some elves, many of which can hide, and you can prepare for these sorts of things far more readily when you know for a fact that they're going to be coming. It can be a little bit more of a varied thing on the open field, because how much Dorwinion want to invest in their cavalry can have a big impact on the rest of their roster on the whole as well, because of the expense of some of their elven units. But still, on the whole, as a Dorwinion player, you're going to have fewer varied whole army compositions that you can realistically dip into. And obviously if you're facing off against Dorwinion, this is a plus point, because you can prepare in broad strokes, like I said, for a certain type of army, and then it's going to come down to your own ability to enact your plans to try and counteract what Dorwinion are going to be throwing at you. And the one thing that you're going to be on the lookout for if you're facing off against Dorwinion, or aiming for I should say, is the fact that their elven units are pretty fragile overall. The elven units are going to be where you want to be dealing most of your damage if you are capable, because they're going to be the ones that are going to be the greatest danger to you, both from afar and up close, on horseback as well. All of their cavalry, like I said, is elven cavalry. And most of this comes down to the fact that the Morroquendi have far more in common with their nearby Sylvan elf cousins, in the fact that their armour scores are not particularly high, and that means that you can more easily range them down if you're able to uncover them, because many of them can hide. So there are ways and means for Dorwinion to try and counteract the fact that their elven units are relatively fragile, obviously relatively low on numbers as well, so things can go pretty wrong for you as Dorwinion pretty quickly if you don't respect the fact that your elven units do need a little bit of looking after and delivering to the situations in which they can be at their most effective. And once you've done this, of course, the elves can go about their work and be very, very successful, and that's not too dissimilar to the other elven factions in the game overall. But yeah, you do need to definitely look after them to get the best out of them, because if you don't, it's a lot of money down the drain, and the human units on their own have their own problems, and that is the fact that limited damage on human units as a general rule. The bodyguard tier unit as an individual example this doesn't really apply to them as such, but the rank and file, all of the Elven units, they are much more functional in nature. They are designed to take damage effectively and stand and fight for as long as possible, and take the heat off some of the elven units a little bit more, so that they can be a little bit more effective. And that's why if you lose many of your elven units because they've been ranged down, or because they've been overwhelmed because of their lower numbers, and you're down to only your basic human units to try and see you over the line, their limited damage dealing capabilities may well mean that you find yourself in a hole that you can't really dig yourself out of. So again, the interplay between the two classes of units is very, very important, because of course the flip side of this is if you only have Elven units left, you don't really have anything that can take damage on a consistent basis in the way that the Elven units can. So that is worth bearing in mind. You need to make sure that that synergy is in effect. You need to make sure that the elves and the humans are working together to really get the most out of this roster, because any one of them on their own is far less than the combination of the two in terms of the strengths that they can deploy upon the field. But I think now, speaking of which, we will take a closer look at what DORWINION have to offer on the grassy plain and see some of the purple-clad units up close and personal. So you can clearly see here with the army laid out on the screen the fact that there are not very many individual units in DORWINION, at least compared to some other factions. And you can also clearly see the human-elven split, with the more entry-level units tending to be human, and then all of the other units beyond that being elven in nature, with one exception in the bodyguard tiers where the humans do have a representative in DORWINION's higher tiers. But also one of the things which does keep DORWINION's roster down, at least from a visual perspective here, is the fact that they don't have armour upgrades either. All of their units come with the highest level of armour that they are capable of wearing, and for the most part the armoured units tend to be the human ones, at least the ones that pride themselves on such things a little bit more so. But we'll get right into things with one of these human units, starting off with the Elven infantry, and this, pretty typical of many of the Western kingdoms of men in Middle-earth, is going to be a very well armoured, and you can see the total defence score being 27 is going to be significantly higher than many of the rank and file from factions like Gondor and Arthedain, which are more in the low 20s rather than into the mid and upper 20s. And a big part of this is the fact that their defensive skill is going to be higher. The armour of 10 is also going to be the kind of values that you would expect to see from a fully upgraded unit from these factions. So again, it's another sign that DORWINION just come with that armour as standard. But it is going to be the defensive skill, also a good shield value as well. So all around those defensive stats, which is the main thing that you want from a line infantry unit really. You want them to be able to stand and fight for as long as possible, and that is what the Elven infantry's primary and kind of only purpose on the battlefield is, because their attack score of 5 is either on par or even slightly lower actually than some other human swordsmen, so they do pay a little bit of a cost perhaps for their superior defense, but also the fact that they have that stamina like I mentioned, so they're not going to lose effectiveness over the long haul of a battle as quickly as some equivalent units from other factions. But it is that total defense score that does stand out, the armor of 10 of course being high, the defensive skill of 9, nice shield value, so they're also going to be very effective at absorbing arrow fire. The one other thing that's worth mentioning is the Elven infantry are not alone in this regard, but they do have a slightly lower man count than some of the other human kingdoms' mainline infantry units. So for example, Gondor and Arthedain both have units that crest over the 200 mark in this regard. So slightly lower numbers, but like I said, they're not alone in that regard. So factions like Cardlan and Dale have to have the same level of numbers that the Elven have, but they don't have some of the perks that the fighting men of DORWINION do have to work with. And a recruitment cost of only 500 means that you're not exactly paying through the nose for this kind of unit either. However, the other units, in again typical human kingdom fashion, you also have a basic unit of spears, and this is perhaps where you can level a little bit more criticism at the Elven Vanguard, because it's a very similar story here, albeit the attack score is even lower, and of course with the spear malus applied to this, they have kind of the same issue that the entry-level Cardlan spears have, in the sense that with the spear malus and the very low base attack, their ability to deal damage to other infantry units is very low even by spear standards, so they are going to be very reliant on that high defensive ability that they have. Obviously spears have that sort of perk, I suppose you would say, where the faster attacking animations means that they can stagger enemy units a little bit more easily, and it does make them a little bit better on the defense, but it will still take them a while for those hits to actually translate into kills because of the attack score of only 3. The total defense actually does drop by 1, and this is a result of the defensive skill going down by a tick as well, which is obviously not a good thing, but it's also not exactly the most significant thing in the world either. Spears also come with all of the trimmings that you would expect them to, so they can make shield wall, more of a useful thing in a siege battle, and even then it can be a little bit situational. But the bonus fighting cavalry is obviously going to be useful, with Dorwinion having an Elven contingent, which is a little bit squishier than you would like it to be. You know, guarding them against cavalry charges is going to be something which is important, and the Elven Vanguard on the open field can do that either up front or on the flank. 650 is a little bit more than the equivalent swordsman, however, and they actually do take a noticeable downturn in terms of their man count as well, which again is the sort of thing which often you will see in some of the human kingdoms, albeit because they start off with a slightly higher man count. The Elven Vanguard do dip down below 150 and only 143 of them, so that is worth bearing in mind. Dorwinion, you know, even though they do have these human offerings that do have, you know, more numbers to them than the Elven units, which we're about to get into, even here they do have a slightly lower man count than equivalent human kingdoms elsewhere. So, you know, numbers are not necessarily the highest, but it's not really an overall weakness because, you know, they are able to cover this a little bit easier. However, the Elven units are where we're going to be dealing a little bit more damage as Dorwinion, starting off with the regular shock infantry that they have, the Nandor Glade Guard. 800 is a decent outlay. I mean, this is the sort of price that you would pay for a higher end unit of shock infantry from some of the Evil Men and Orcish factions, but again, they are an Elven unit, so when you look over at what their stats are like, an attack of 16, charge bonus of 15, so that's obviously pretty hefty, and obviously you have the effectiveness against armour. If you can land the charge as well in conjunction with that pretty beefy charge bonus, you have the fear effect as well, so you can send units routing, albeit that is more common in cavalry than it is with shock infantry, but still, it is still a possibility against certain foes. And the total defense score is also pretty high for a shock infantry unit, and again, that's their Elven lineage really shining through, the fact that they have a pretty high defensive skill, the kind of defensive skill you would expect to see perhaps from a heavy swordsman more so than an armour-piercing shock infantry unit, but again, they do wield glaives rather than axes, so maybe a little bit more of a finesse-based weapon rather than the brutality of a two-handed axe. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows for the Nandor Glade Guard. They do have a very significant weakness, and that is the fact they don't have a shield, and their armour score is very low. So in stark contrast really to the Elven just in front of them, as soon as archers have them in their sights, this is going to be one of the most efficient targets for enemy forces to go after because of that squishy nature, like I said. And it's perhaps on full display here really with the Nandor Glade Guard and the equivalent cavalry unit, which we'll get onto a little bit later. But a couple of other things they do have in their favour there is the fact that they can't hide anywhere. So they're only going to be made vulnerable when the enemy either uncover them or when you have to move them. So you do have a little bit of leeway there. It's not quite the same as it is with a unit of archers, where you can be a little bit more... You tend to pick more so than anything else, but it's probably going to be uncovered due to necessity on the open field and the like for the Nandor Glade Guard. But it just gives you that extra breathing room. And the fact they can hide anywhere can also mean that they can entrap cavalry, and all of the Morroquendi that wield these glaives also have a bonus against cavalry, so that's a nice little boost for them as well. Again, a significant unit really for Dorwinion, because this is going to be something that they really rely upon when it comes to their defence, are the Morroquendi pikes. Now, Elven pikes in general tend to have a little bit more about them when it comes to dealing damage, which is often a criticism that you could levy at pikes. The fact that they don't do damage that quickly, so while you can outlast opponents with them, if it comes down to just your polearms trying to get you over the line in the late game, you can be biting your nails a little bit just to see if your units are going to have the damage to see you over the line. That's less of a problem with Elven pikes. The Morroquendi pikes with an attack of 10, along with that phalanx formation that all pikes have, of course, going to be very, very useful. The Morroquendi pikes do have a bit of an issue with their armour as well, only marginally better than the Nandor Glade Guard that we just mentioned, and of course they cannot hide everywhere like the Nandor can. So they will of course be one of the main targets that enemies are trying to go after with their long range and shorter range skirmishers, to be fair. The other stats, it's a little bit more difficult to get a read on with pikes. 800 is a pretty hefty outlay on a pike unit as well, which is, you know, reasonably low in numbers as you would expect from an Elven unit. 123, they have the individual quality, but pikes, they very much are more than, you know, they make up more than the sum of their parts when there are a lot of them when they're in formation. But the upside to this is that the Morroquendi pikes almost all the time are going to be marching very closely in step with the Elven that are just in front of them, and they can cover for most of the Morroquendi's weaknesses, in fairness, and that's a pretty solid front line with the, you know, the defensive and armoured nature of the human infantry, and then the long-range weapon and slightly better damage than equivalent pikes that the Morroquendi do offer as well. So they're going to be a real linchpin, both on the open field where they'll make up the centre of most Dorwinion armies, I think, but also in a siege where, you know, this kind of unit is often a bit of a necessity for the units that have access to long weapons to really start clogging up those choke points, especially when they're capable of dishing out a little bit of extra damage like these guys. Speaking of damaging units, however, when it comes to bodyguard units, Dorwinion are well stocked, especially when it comes to their infantry. The Elven Hammerguard are the one example of a really high-tier human unit that the Elven have, and you would suggest that this is the Vintner Lord and his retinue. 1300 is about what you would expect for a unit like this when we've looked at some of the other factions. They've got a similar look to them as some of the Arnorian kingdoms much further west than they, albeit with their own purple colour scheme, and maybe, that again, a little bit more Cardlan-esque perhaps than Arthedain, although they may be far apart from one another. 16 attack, but this attack is armour piercing because they have got that hammer that they wield. I mean, Dorwinion do have access to a decent amount of armour piercing, not an overwhelming amount, but here and there they do have it with the shock infantry that we've just seen. We'll go on to look at javelins and cavalry a little bit later on, but when it comes to that really high-end quality, the Elven Hammerguard are going to be your option there. 73 means that they're not the most numerous bodyguard unit of their type, but they're not the least numerous either. And of course defensive stats, as you would imagine from a shielded human bodyguard unit that's heavily armoured like this. Pretty good, pretty evenly spread as well. The armour score of 10 is equivalent to the rest of the Elven, but of course that second hit point makes a big difference to their individual survivability. Good defensive skill and a good shield value as well. So pretty much everything you would want, and that little bit of extra danger that the armour piercing offers them as well is always good. Also, I think they're one of the best looking bodyguard units in the game as well. A very, very nice look to them indeed. But if you want something with maybe a little bit more finesse rather than the brutality of a hammer, you have the Morroquendi Glade Masters. Again, same cost at 1300, but they do have a few different approaches. So the attack score, 20. Total defense is also higher, but then that mostly, well, the total defense is all bound up really in the defensive skill of 28, with the hit points of 2. When it comes to just a pure melee slog against another unit, there are very few units in the entire game that are going to have the same sort of staying power as the Morroquendi Glade Masters. Though unlike with a few other units with really high melee defense, their armor score is very low, as you will have come to expect already, I'm sure, from the Morroquendi. So again, while they do have that second hit point to buy them a little bit more time than the Elven units that we've already mentioned, if enemy archers do see them, then they're going to be one of the more efficient targets that you can afford to go after. Inspiration of nearby troops, bonus fighting cavalry, again, fear, effectiveness against armour, all good things. A rather interesting thing about them is that they can do Skiltron formation, which is usually reserved for sort of select entry-level spear units, like really entry-level militia spears, so it's a little bit of a weird one. I mean, I guess it's better to have it and not need it, but I can't imagine, because they're a relatively small unit as well. I guess when you're sort of fighting back to back, it might be really difficult to break them down in the late game if it's just pure infantry on infantry late on to try and close out a battle, so maybe that's the thinking there. But yeah, an interesting one to see. I mean, I wonder if we'll ever actually see a player use the Skiltron formation in an actual battle, but yeah, very, very powerful unit when it comes to dishing out some damage and keeping themselves alive with defensive skill, but like all the other Morroquendi, perhaps a little bit lacking when it comes to their abilities, well, to their armour and all of the problems that may entail. A unit that we have seen before in the faction of Dale is the River Patrol, an entry-level javelin unit, which is always going to be a useful thing, certainly on the attack in a siege, but also, you know, they're such a cheap unit really in the grand scheme of things for the kind of damage that they can dish out. 500, you know, and with the shield value, you know, their melee stats are obviously pretty poor, but there are units in the game which are significantly worse off than even these guys. You know, the padded Gambeson doesn't really offer them too much protection in the grand scheme of things, comparatively speaking anyway, with an armor score of only 3. Defensive skill as well. The shield is the main thing here because it just gives them that little bit of extra survivability against enemy archers, who will certainly try to skirmish them down if given the opportunity. And again, in melee terms, they're not really fantastic either, although melee attack of 5 is kind of equivalent to some of the entry-level Elven, but it's obviously their own survivability and their own numbers actually a little bit worse off, so they're certainly not going to be as good in that regard. It's all about the missile attack, really. Missile attack of 6, a little bit better off than some of the very entry-level units that we've seen elsewhere. But yeah, cheap javelins are cheap javelins. The strengths and weaknesses of them are going to be the same across every faction, really. And Dorwinion will be very glad for their presence, I'm sure. And of course, their gambesons also a little bit purple in coloration in comparison to the Dalian blue. Now then, moving on to the Elven marksman. So the standard rank and file archer unit that Dorwinion have available to them. This is going to be your skirmishing archer. You can deploy sharpened stakes, which is always nice. Not the most numerous unit in the world, 123, but good armor, like we've already said, and it comes with the armor of 10 as standard. In melee terms, they're not particularly impressive, but again, it's all about really being, for a human archer like this, which is a little bit more heavily armored, they're going to be far more concerned with being a bit of a speed bump for opposition forces, being a solid brick of armor, and in the Elven's case, actually having a decent defensive skill value of 9. So, you know, late on that they're not going to be a pushover, but, you know, with a melee attack of 4, they're not going to be the most damaging unit in the world either, especially after going through a bit of a skirmish phase, which is going to be quite common for these guys. They're not going to be at full strength either, but there are going to be relatively few archers in the game which are going to be comfortable at skirmishing back and forth with the Elven marksman. Missile attack of 6 is pretty standard fare for a heavier human archer. Again, Dorwinion are not the best faction in the game when it comes to that slog of a long-range archer duel, but a unit like this means that they can be competitive in these kinds of engagements, especially when they're fighting side by side with the Elven archer that they have at their disposal as Dorwinion, which are the Morroquendi bows. Now, in the same way, of course, the armor score is lower, but pretty much everything else about the Morroquendi bows is going to be better. Now, 800, again, is about par for the course of what you would expect from an upper-end sort of mainline Elven archer. They bear a little bit more in common with the Elves of Mirkwood, perhaps, given the fact they sort of prioritise armour a little bit lower. But good attack, missile attack of 8, again, is, you know, what you would expect from an Elven archer of this level. They're going to be significantly more dangerous in melee from a damage dealing perspective than the Elven just in front of them as well, which tracks with the faction as a whole, with an attack of 13, bonus fighting cavalry in melee as well, which is always useful for an archer unit like this, because very often if you're on the open field, marauding cavalry will try and shut down your skirmish lines, because it's often one of the softer targets, maybe not so much with Dorwinion, considering the glaives they have as their melee weapon. They can also deploy sharpened stakes as well. Defensive score, of course, defensive skill, despite their armour being a little bit lower, their defensive skill is still higher. So again, in typical Elven fashion really for their mainline archers, they are going to be fairly comfortable when it comes to getting involved in the melee at the end to try and see their team over the line. Again, 800 is a fairly hefty outlay perhaps, but one thing that they do have in their favour, even over their fellow elves, is the fact they have poison projectiles. Most of their fellow elves anyway. Those poison projectiles, of course, lowering the morale of enemy forces, which, considering the damage that elves just do from a baseline perspective, it's particularly good in a defensive siege where you're firing into a choke point. The enemy can often lose their stomach for fighting far faster when you're utilising poison, and it's just, again, one of those nice little things to have, which can make the difference in select situations. Again, better to have it and not need it. And now for the cavalry, which Dorwinion do have a decent selection of, all of which is Elven. They don't have any human cavalry units, interestingly enough. The Nandor Glade Riders are the mounted equivalent of the Nandor Glade Guard that we saw before, and they are one of those entry-level Lancer units that manages to get the charge bonus of 20, which is as high as it goes for most sort of regular cavalry units. So the 20 bonus with the effectiveness against armour, if you land a charge, it's going to be every bit as devastating, if not more so, because of the unit count as some of the best units of Lance Knights in the game. As you would expect, however, the obvious downside to this is the fact that the Nandor Glade Riders are a pretty squishy unit of cavalry indeed. Again, the attack is decent. The defensive skill is okay, so if they do get engaged with melee cavalry, they will be able to at least wriggle free without taking catastrophic losses. But they still won't fare too well in that kind of engagement. And obviously, as soon as enemy archers see them on the field, they are going to get zoned out. With the armour score being so low and the lack of a shield, they do only cost 700, which, I mean, is not a small amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but for a unit of cavalry with the ceiling that these guys have, maybe it is. I don't know. It's one of those things where you really will have to look after them, and they could potentially be one of the best value units that the game has to offer. But more often than not, I think, you know, their squishiness is going to be a little bit of a liability against a force which is prepared for your cavalry. So it's going to be key, really, in terms of, you know, how you utilise them. But also, using them in conjunction with your other cavalry can be a useful thing. Speaking of which, we have one of the units of cavalry in the game that can hide anywhere in the Morroquendi Stalkers, which makes them a little bit of a, you know, curiosity in the Dorwinion line. They are the mounted version of the Morroquendi bows. The fact they can hide anywhere is really what sets them apart from many other horse archers in the game. They also have that bonus fighting cavalry and melee as well, so not too dissimilar perhaps from the Linden cavalry as well, where they've got the horse archers which are also spear cavalry. Kind of similar, but the Linden cavalry can't hide anywhere, whereas the Morroquendi can. Also, the Morroquendi have those poison projectiles on horseback as well, so that's another point in favour of the Dorwinion riders. And as far as their melee stats go, pretty good, honestly. Defensive skill of 12, melee attack of 12, so there's certainly no pushovers in melee, and they are a common, you know, addition to the Dorwinion army. I think they're a little bit more easy to use, perhaps, than the Nandor that we just looked at, because while the Nandor have got that really high charge bonus, they're pretty unforgiving when it comes to, again, dealing with range threats and dealing with enemy cavalry up close, whereas the Morroquendi Stalkers, in both regards, are a little bit better off, I would suggest. Not so much against foot-based projectiles, you know, they need to rely on their hiding for that, really, but certainly against enemy cavalry, they are a little bit better positioned, perhaps. But when it comes to dealing with enemy cavalry, of course, very often it's going to be the job of your best unit in that regard, and the Morroquendi Glade Lords are that. You know, 1550 is a big cost, but, you know, for the very best cavalry in the game, or at least in the best class of cavalry in the game, this is what you have to pay, because, again, the ceiling on these guys is also extremely high. Charge bonus of 20, attack of 8, defensive abilities far higher, and I think they're the one unit of Morroquendi that actually have a decent armour score at 8, but obviously they combine that with what was already good defensive skill, a shield and a second hit point, which gives them more rigidity than their fellow Dorwinion elves. But yeah, inspiration of nearby troops for cavalry again. Don't know how useful that is in a real battle situation, but the fear certainly will be when they get those glaives down and connect with the enemy in a big charge. Bonus fighting cavalry, of course, as well, as most units of this type have. Probably the most similar unit to them. I mean, it's hard to tell, really. The other two Elven Lance Knights from Linden and Imladris, they're probably the happy middle ground between those two units, honestly. Imladris being a bit bulkier in terms of armour, Linden maybe having the edge when it comes to their melee abilities with that two-handed blade. But yeah, an interesting force. I mean, when it comes to comparing the cavalry directly, it'll be interesting to see which of the three tends to be the best. But yeah, obviously the crown jewel, really, of the Dorwinion cavalry force, and you often see them because, you know, this kind of unit, they are much more forgiving because of that second hit point. You can utilise them well, and it's a little bit easier to micro them, and they won't necessarily completely get demolished when you're not looking for 10 seconds. And finally, as it's the case with most of the other Elven factions, all of the other Elven factions, I think, actually, the ballista, a standard ballista, is the only artillery piece that Dorwinion have to work with, but it's also the most dependable unit of artillery, so, you know, it's not really the end of the world that this is what you have. Good damage potential, obviously. It's very dependent on sight lines and such, but also good for sniping out enemy artillery. Even though it takes more than one bolt now, that is still something the ballista does better than other artillery pieces, just because of its accuracy. And also something else which we now know that it is also pretty good at is the fact that on the open field you can push your enemy around a little bit more if you have artillery dominance, and that's the sort of thing which a ballista is very good at establishing and then taking advantage of. So when you combine that with the sort of the hidden units, the Elven finesse and damage, and then the solid front line that you have as well, you can mould your enemy to making mistakes a little bit more easily with this sort of unit, and that fits with what Dorwinion are about as a whole, I think. So there we have it, Dorwinion, a rather enigmatic little kingdom, tucked away sort of further east than most of the other good aligned kingdoms of Middle-earth are, so they are in a rather precarious spot, especially with Rune on the march, and of course more well known for their wine perhaps than their military abilities, but that wine is where we will be following our trail to the next faction we will be taking a look at, because a sampler of their wares, a well-known sampler of their wares, is Thranduil, the leader of the Woodland Realm, ever the fan favourite faction, I would suggest. Mirkwood, to give them their other name. They will be the next ones that we will be taking a look at. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.